Wright. One of the topics I am going to be talking about today is recovery after injury. One of the things that, after I've worked with brain injury for 20 years is that all the recoveries seem to be a little bit different. I have the next slide. And I'm talking in particular about individuals that are discharged from acute rehabilitation with a high level of needs. These are people that need someone there at all points, at all periods of time to be safe. Next slide, please. So what sort of needs are we talking about after brain injury? There's physical, there's cognitive, there's emotional, there's social, and there's probably more too, because everybody's individual, everybody has a different set of needs. Next slide, please. But what about these people that are discharged? They're getting ready to leave acute rehabilitation, and for whatever reason, they have such a high level of needs assistance that they need someone around at all times. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. So we're one of the 16 traumatic brain injury model system centers. I work at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, and we have data going back about 20 years. And this is just a short longitudinal study from data from our own center, where we looked at these high needs individuals and we followed them over 2 years to find out what happened to them. We looked at their functional status, we looked at their residence, and we looked at their employment or productive activity status. Next slide, please. So what we're using to determine this high level of needs and functional status is a measure called the disability rating scale. In particular, there's an item on there called the level of functioning variable. And one of the things it does is it breaks people into a dichotomy of people that need a resident helper, somebody there all the time, or a non-resident helper or independent, someone that can basically take care of themselves and may need someone to check in on them. And as you start going down the resident helper line, the sort of people I'm talking about today are labeled as moderately dependent, meaning that they can take care of most of their own daily life needs, but still need someone there all the time. Someone who's markedly dependent, which means they need help with all major life activities, and totally dependent, which means basically they need somebody to help them with all major, that they're actually not contributing towards a lot of their activities. Next slide, please. So from our own facility, for the study we're looking at, we followed 333 people. And of those, 124 fell into this moderately, markedly, and totally dependent. These are people that, even after our inpatient rehabilitation, still required significant assistance at follow-up. Next slide, please. So when we looked at what happened over them, there was actually, for me, some good news and some surprising news that when we look at our independent people or non-resident people in terms of people living in private residences going home, for the independent people, it's about 98%. When we're looking at our moderate needs people, it's about 91, 95, 93%, still in the 90%. We look at the markedly dependent group, it starts off quite a bit lower, 64%, but increases almost to the same level, almost to 90%. When we look at the totally dependent people, they were the worst off at discharge, less than half of them living in private residences. But across time, at 2 years, 71% living in private residences. Next slide, please. When we look at productive activity, and productive activity was defined as employment, schoolwork, homemaker, or volunteer activity. We saw some interesting things. Of course, with brain injury, it's a lot lower than what we'd like to see. This moderately dependent group at year 1, about 34% returning to some sort of productive activity. And by year 2, 44%. For the markedly dependent group, 17% increasing to 27%. Both those groups improving about 10% over that 2-year period of time. So we're still seeing some improvement. The totally dependent group, not so much improvement, down at about 10 to 11%. Next slide, please. When we look at the 2-year functional improvement, and this is the part that was really exciting to me that I didn't know at the time. When we look at the group that started off moderate at discharge, 75% of them improved over that 2-year period of time to where they did not need someone with them at all times. So they improved to a status where they were either independent or could have a non-resident helper help them. For the markedly dependent group, 81% showed some improvement, with a little bit more than half of them improving to where they no longer needed a person with them at all times. And when we looked at the totally dependent group, we saw 95% of them improved somewhat functionally. They had nowhere else to go because they were totally dependent. But 24% of them actually got to a point where they did not need a resident or a full-time assistant. Next slide, please. So in summary, it's been really quick. We do see a lot of high needs people, even at acute rehab discharge. The bad news is that they're out there, but the good news is that we're seeing change over the next few years. And there's a lot of programs and opportunities out there for these people. I didn't try to capture that in this sort of very brief presentation, but what I hope that I've captured for you is that even with people that look like are going to have poor outcomes, that quite a few of them have improved in function, residence, and productivity over a 2-year period of time. Next slide. And as Lily Tomlin said, the road to success is always under construction. So, last slide. And thank you to the participants that are always an important part of our national database studies. Are there questions, please?